This happened in the fall of 1967, and to this day, I don't like talking about it. My name is Harold, and back then, I was 32 years old, living in a cabin on the outskirts of Point Pleasant, West Virginia. I had been hunting since I was a boy. My father taught me early on, and it was both a means of survival and a passion. I loved the solitude of the forest, the quiet broken only by the rustling of leaves and the distant call of a crow. That morning, I set out at dawn with my rifle and a canteen of hot coffee, ready to spend hours tracking whatever prey crossed my path. I wasn't superstitious, but from the very start of that day, something felt off. The scent of the trees was heavier, thicker, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. After a few hours with no luck, I finally spotted a deer. A beautiful buck, but it was limping on one of its hind legs, probably already wounded by another hunter or a predator. I took my shot and hit it in the flank, but it didn't go down. It bolted into the dense woods, and determined not to waste my kill, I followed. I tracked the blood trail for nearly half an hour, moving down a path I didn't recognize. The vegetation grew thicker, and the silence became more oppressive with every step. No wind, no birds, nothing but the sound of my own footsteps and my heavy breathing. Then I saw where the trail led, a deep ravine where sunlight barely touched the ground. That's when I felt it. I was not alone. I crouched at the edge of the ravine, scanning the dense undergrowth below. The deer was nowhere in sight, but the blood trail continued down, vanishing into the shadows. I hesitated. Something about that place felt wrong. The trees leaned inward unnaturally, their twisted branches stretching like skeletal fingers. The air was thick, almost damp, carrying a faint, rancid smell like meat left out too long. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was being foolish, and started descending carefully, my rifle gripped tightly. As I reached the bottom, the silence deepened, pressing against my ears like I had submerged under water. Then I heard a soft rustling, followed by a low, guttural grunt. I froze. Another grunt, then another, overlapping, coming from just beyond a cluster of thick bushes. Slowly, I crept forward and pushed the branches aside. My breath hitched. There, in the dim light, crouched a group of figures, thin, naked, their skin stretched tight over their bones. They were huddled together, their long limbs moving in slow, jerky motions as they pawed at something on the ground. I couldn't see what it was at first, but then I noticed the fresh smear of blood beneath them. The deer. I barely had time to process what I was looking at before one of them lifted its head. Its face was human but wrong. The skin was ashen, stretched too tightly over sharp cheekbones, and its eyes were small, sunken, and completely black. Its nose was little more than 2 slits, and its mouth, God, its mouth. It grinned at me, wide and unnatural, revealing a set of jagged, needle-like teeth stained dark with blood. My stomach twisted. The thing sniffed the air, cocking its head like a curious animal, and then let out a breathy, garbled sound that sent a chill straight through me. Before I could move, the others turned too. One by one, those sunken eyes locked onto me, their expressions shifting from dull vacancy to something else recognition. Hunger. Their grunts grew louder, more frantic, and they began to rise to their feet in unnatural twitching motions. Some of them were missing patches of hair, others had raw, open wounds that should have been fatal, but they stood as if they felt nothing. My instincts finally kicked in. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my rifle, and turned to run. But before I could even take a step, the first one let out a sharp, guttural cry. And then they moved. They came at me faster than anything that thin and malnourished had any right to move. Their bare feet barely made a sound against the damp earth, but I could hear their breath, ragged and wet, as they closed the distance. I didn't think I just raised my rifle and fired. The shot echoed through the ravine, deafening in the silence. The first one jerked back as the bullet tore through its chest, but it didn't fall. It staggered, twitched, then straightened again, that horrible grin never leaving its face. Panic surged through me. I turned and ran, tearing through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face and arms. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get out of that ravine. Behind me, I could hear them crashing through the foliage, grunting and snarling. They weren't speaking, but there was a rhythm to their sounds, a pattern, like they were communicating in a language I couldn't understand. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I pushed on, my only thought to reach higher ground, to put as much distance as I could between myself and whatever the hell those things were. The incline was steep, the soil loose beneath my boots, but I didn't stop. I scrambled upward, clawing at roots and rocks to keep from sliding back down. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear anything else, but then, just as I reached the top, I caught a sound that made my blood run cold. Laughter. Low, breathy, unnatural. Not joyous, not human. It was mocking, like they were amused by my struggle. I didn't dare look back. I bolted through the trees, ignoring the burning in my legs, the way my vision blurred at the edges. I knew these woods like the back of my hand, but in my blind panic, everything felt unfamiliar. Branches twisted into unnatural shapes, the shadows stretched too far. I could still hear them rustling, grunting, that sickening laughter, but they weren't chasing me anymore. They were just following, keeping pace, hurting me. The realization sent a fresh wave of terror through me. They were leading me somewhere. I forced myself to slow down, my instinct screaming that running blindly was exactly what they wanted. My breath came in ragged gasps as I scanned the trees, trying to get my bearings. Then, I saw it through a gap in the branches, maybe 50 yards ahead, a clearing. If I could just reach open ground, maybe I'd have a chance. Clutching my rifle, I pushed forward, my body running on pure adrenaline. The laughter behind me faded, replaced by something worse: silence. The moment I burst into the clearing, I knew I had made a mistake. The ground beneath my boots was wrong, too soft, as if the earth itself had been disturbed. The air carried that same rancid stench from before, stronger now, thick enough to choke on. And then I saw them, more of them. Dozens, maybe more, standing in the tree line, motionless. Their hollow eyes reflected the dim light like an animal's, their emaciated bodies rigid, waiting. I had walked straight into their den. I stopped dead in my tracks, my pulse hammering in my ears. They didn't move. They just stood there watching. Their bodies were wrong, too long in some places, too thin in others, their ribs pressing through their sickly skin. Some had patches of hair, others had none. Their fingers twitched, their mouths slightly open, revealing those needle-like teeth. I gripped my rifle, my hands slick with sweat. If I ran, they'd chase me. If I stayed, I didn't know what they'd do. Then one of them stepped forward. It was taller than the rest, its limbs too long, its joints moving with an unnatural fluidity. Its head tilted to one side, then the other, studying me. Slowly, it lifted a hand and pointed, not at me, but past me. Behind me, the hairs on my neck stood up. I didn't want to turn around. Every instinct told me that whatever was there, whatever they were directing me toward, was worse than them. But I had no choice. My body moved on its own. I turned, and I saw it. At first, I couldn't comprehend what I was looking at. My mind refused to process it, like my brain was rejecting something it wasn't meant to see. A mound of earth rose in the center of the clearing, but it wasn't just dirt. Bones jutted out at odd angles, tangled with rotting flesh and something dark, pulsing beneath the surface, something alive. The ground itself seemed to breathe, shifting slightly with a wet, sickening sound. Then it moved. A long skeletal hand emerged from the mound, its fingers impossibly thin, the skin stretched so tight I could see the tendons beneath. Another hand followed. Then, slowly, something pulled itself up from the mass of bone and decay. It had the same gaunt, twisted features as the creatures surrounding me, but it was different, taller, older. Its hollow eyes locked onto mine, and it smiled. Not just with its mouth, with its entire face. The skin rippled, splitting at the corners of its lips, stretching far beyond what should have been possible. My stomach lurched. I had seen many things in my life, but nothing that made me feel like prey the way that thing did. I couldn't move. My body locked up, every muscle screaming at me to run, but I was frozen. The thing in the mound kept pulling itself free, its body unfolding like it had been compressed for too long. Its limbs were too long, too thin, its fingers twitching as if testing the air. The creatures around me started making those guttural sounds again, grunts, clicking noises, strange rhythmic breaths. It wasn't random, they were communicating. And whatever they were saying, it was for that thing. Then it took a step toward me. My body finally obeyed. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my rifle. I had one shot left. One shot, and I knew it wouldn't matter. The thing grinned wider, sensing my fear, enjoying it. The others remained still, their black eyes watching, waiting. It reached for me, and without thinking, I raised my rifle and fired. The shot echoed through the clearing. For a second, everything was silent. Then the thing stopped smiling. The bullet hit it square in the chest, but it didn't fall. It didn't even flinch. Instead, it slowly tilted its head down, staring at the hole in its torso as if mildly curious. Then it looked back at me, and it laughed. A deep, wet, gurgling sound that sent ice through my veins. The laughter spread. The creatures around me began chuckling, grunting, their strange voices blending into something awful, something that made my skin crawl. I turned and ran. I didn't think, didn't plan, I just ran. The forest around me blurred, trees twisting as my vision tunneled. I could hear them behind me, not chasing, just following, mocking. The laughter never stopped. It was in my ears, in my head, as if the whole damn forest was laughing at me. I don't know how long I ran, only that somehow I made it back to my truck. I practically threw myself inside, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I almost couldn't start the engine. When the truck roared to life, I slammed my foot on the gas, not daring to look back. The road back felt longer than it should have. My headlights cut through the trees, but the darkness between them seemed thicker, deeper, like the forest itself was stretching out, trying to keep me inside. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The laughter was gone, but the silence it left behind was worse. I kept expecting to see something in my rearview mirror, those hollow eyes, that stretched grin, but the road stayed empty. When I finally made it home, I locked every door, every window. I shut the curtains, turned on every light, and sat in the corner with my rifle, shaking so badly I thought I'd never stop. I didn't sleep that night. Hell, I didn't sleep for days. The image of that thing, the way it moved, the way it smiled, it stayed with me. I never went back to that part of the woods. Never hunted alone again. And even now, all these years later, I still hear it sometimes. When the night is too quiet, when the wind moves just right, I hear that laughter. And I know they're still out there, watching, waiting,